Tim Smith's story is not just about a man making liquor. It is the story of resilience, survival, and a deep connection to family tradition. It is about how one individual transformed a complex and risky mountain craft into a lifelong journey, carrying with him both joys and heartbreaks that the world rarely witnessed in full. In this video, we will be exploring the life and sad experiences of Tim Smith, the man whose roots as a moonshiner defined his destiny. When you talk about the long and fascinating history of moonshining in America, it becomes nearly impossible not to mention the name Tim Smith. He stands as one of the most iconic and memorable figures in this age-old practice. But his story is far greater than simply brewing corn whiskey in secret woods or smoky barns. It is about surviving under the weight of family tradition, facing the unrelenting challenges of law enforcement, and enduring the very real tragedies that shaped him into the man he ultimately became. Tim Smith was born in Climax, Virginia, a quiet little town so small that if you blink while driving through, you might miss it altogether. Yet, despite its size, Climax carried with it a rich history, filled with tales of men who risked everything to produce and transport illegal liquor. During the era of Prohibition, and well beyond, for young Tim, his early years were spent watching his father and grandfather work hidden stills deep in the backwoods, passing down a family tradition that had survived since before the 1920s. Back in those times, when the entire nation was forced dry under Prohibition, moonshiners were not simply viewed as criminals. They were often celebrated as heroes within their communities. These were the people who kept the flow of spirits alive when the government insisted no one could drink legally. And so, Tim grew up in a world where hard work was not optional, but essential. A world where you learned to fix a broken truck engine before you were even allowed to drive it, where you hauled sacks of corn that weighed nearly as much as your small frame before you reached 10 years old, and where you quickly understood that moonshine was not just a drink, it was survival. It put food on the table and clothes on your back, but tragedy was woven into Tim's childhood as much as tradition was. While other children dreamed of playing baseball or going off to college, Tim was already living in fear of raids by federal agents. He witnessed his family bury copper still parts in the dirt, overheard whispered conversations about neighbors who had been caught and jailed, and struggled to make sense of why the government wanted to destroy the only livelihood keeping his people alive. In Climax, moonshining wasn't merely a business, it was culture. It was identity. It was pride. Tim vividly remembered the stories told by his grandfather, describing the old days when revenuers, as federal agents were once called, would come storming in with axes to smash barrels. Men would scatter into the woods, guns in hand, while dogs barked into the night. These weren't bedtime stories. They were survival lessons, warnings carved into memory. From them, Tim learned toughness, persistence, and the art of moving forward even when the law was breathing down your neck. One of the earliest turning points in his life came in the late 1970s. Tim was still just a boy when his father was nearly caught in a raid that could have locked him away for years. He would never forget the fear in his mother's eyes as trucks rumbled closer and the sound of heavy boots crunched on gravel. That night, the family had to destroy an entire batch of moonshine, pouring it into the dirt so no evidence could be found. Watching his family's hard work literally sink into the ground left Tim heartbroken. But it also taught him a powerful lesson that moonshining was never only about making liquor. It was also about secrecy, careful planning, outsmarting opponents who had far more power and resources than you did. By the time Tim reached his teenage years, he was already seasoned in the trade. He knew how to build a still from scratch, how to check proof by shaking a jar and watching the bubbles rise, how to transport liquor down winding back roads without getting caught. But with knowledge came loss. He saw friends and relatives die in car crashes while fleeing the law. He heard about men shot in disputes over territory, and some, tragically, ruined their own lives by drinking too much of their own product. What made Tim's story even more striking was his unusual double life. As a young man, he joined the fire department, dedicating his days to saving lives, while secretly keeping alive the craft of moonshining at night. The irony was almost poetic. A man who ran toward burning houses by day was by night producing something the law still considered illegal. Yet, This was the balance of his reality. The 1980s and 1990s brought tough times for rural Virginia. Work was scarce, and families struggled to survive. Many turned back to the old ways, relying on moonshining to make ends meet. Tim's mother often tried to push him away from the trade, warning him about the risks of prison. She didn't want him to follow the path that had swallowed so many others. But tradition has a grip that is hard to break, and for Tim, walking away from moonshining felt like turning his back on his very roots. By the early 2000s, moonshining had shifted in America's cultural image. It wasn't just a secret trade hidden in the woods anymore. It had become a symbol of rebellion, grit, and Southern pride. When the Discovery Channel launched the reality series Moonshiners in 2011, Tim Smith became one of its central stars. The show exploded in popularity, giving millions of viewers a glimpse into a secret world that had rarely been shown so openly. But fame did not erase Tim's struggles. By the time he appeared on television, he was already no stranger to hardship or loss. To the outside world, his jokes and laughter made him seem lighthearted. But behind that smile was a man who had buried friends too soon, who had watched loved ones dragged away in handcuffs, and who had waited in silence to hear if someone survived a midnight run gone wrong. His past was heavy, and fame did not lighten that weight, it only amplified it. The success of Moonshiners brought recognition but also new pressures. Law enforcement attention increased. Old-timers in the trade criticized him for exposing their secretive world to television cameras, accusing him of disrespecting tradition for profit. And beyond that, Tim had taken on another enormous challenge. Going legal, turning moonshine into a legitimate product, meant navigating government red tape, licensing, taxes, and a system that had once hunted him. It also meant facing backlash from those who believed moonshine should remain in the woods, not in glossy bottles on store shelves. Yet Tim pressed forward. He traveled across states, worked with distillers, and built a legal product that still honored his father's recipe. When Climax Moonshine finally appeared in stores, it was a triumph, proof that decades of running and hiding had finally been brought into the open. But success carried heavy burdens. Money problems, sleepless nights, the stress of juggling television fame, family obligations, and business demands all took their toll. Some of his closest friends from the moonshining world also spiraled into troubled addiction, illness, arrests. Tim could not save them all, and that reality weighed on him deeply. At the same time, his fire service career exposed him daily to tragedy-burning homes, deadly accidents, and the heartbreaking loss of children. He carried these memories with him, knowing that each call reminded him of how fragile life really is. He once said firefighting made him appreciate life more, but it also sharpened his determination to leave behind a legacy worth being proud of. As Moonshiners grew in fame, Tim Smith became a household name. Everywhere he went, people recognized him not always as Tim the man, but as Tim the Moonshiner, Tim the TV star, Tim the brand. The attention was flattering, but it was also isolating. There were days he just wanted to sit quietly, breathe, and feel normal again. But fame rarely allows that kind of peace. And so the dark truth is that as the cameras kept rolling, Tim carried more pain than viewers could ever see. Fame had not made his life easier. If anything, it had magnified his burdens. Behind the laughter, behind the whiskey jars, and behind the television character was a man still wrestling with loss, responsibility, and the weight of an entire tradition on his shoulders. As Tim Smith moved further into the later chapters of his life, his legacy began to take on a new shape. He was no longer just that boy from Climax who learned the trade in the shadows of the woods. He had become a public figure, a symbol of resilience, and, to many, the very face of modern moonshining. But what set him apart from others was the fact that he carried two identities, one that was celebrated on television and another that was rooted in service, sacrifice, and community. On the one hand, Tim was Tim the Moonshiner. It's the man who turned an outlaw tradition into a legal brand and gave viewers a window into a culture they had only heard about in whispers. On the other hand, he remained Tim the firefighter, the man who wore a uniform and ran into burning homes to save lives. This dual role made him unique because it showed the world that moonshiners weren't just criminals hiding in the hills. They were also fathers, neighbors, leaders, and men who risked their own safety for others. But living in that balance was not easy. Fame demanded constant attention, and the legal business brought non-stop challenges. Every step forward seemed to come with a new test, critics questioning his motives, financial hurdles threatening his business, or the emotional strain of being responsible for others who depended on him. Even as his bottles of Climax Moonshine reached store shelves across America, he had to fight to prove that he belonged in the same market as giant whiskey companies with millions of dollars behind them. Yet through it all, Tim never stopped being the man who valued his roots. He spoke often about how his mother's warnings still echoed in his mind, how his father's teachings guided his choices, and how the old ways continued to live through him even if now they were carried in legal jars instead of hidden barrels in the woods. He was determined that his family's history would not be erased or forgotten. For Tim, legacy was about more than profit or fame. It was about respect. Respect for the craft, respect for the culture, and respect for the people who lived it long before there were cameras or TV deals. He wanted the world to understand that moonshiners were not simply lawbreakers. They were survivors who found a way to keep their families alive in the hardest of times. That message became his mission, and it shaped everything he did. As the years went by, the weight of his double life never truly left him. Fame could not erase grief, and money could not erase memories of nights filled with fear, loss, and survival. But what fame did give him was a voice, and he used that voice to shine a light on his culture. He showed the world a hidden side of America, one where hardship bred resilience, where tradition held families together, and where survival often came at a cost. In the end, Tim Smith's story is not just about moonshine. It is about the life of a man who carried both fire and whiskey in his hands, who endured tragedy yet kept standing, and who turned what could have been a forgotten outlaw craft into a lasting legacy. His journey reminds us that behind every legend is a human being, one who has laughed, one who has cried, and one who has fought to make sure their story is remembered by the time the spotlight found him. The pressure on Tim was no longer just about staying out of trouble with the law. It had become something much heavier. It was about protecting his family, keeping his reputation clean, making sure his business stayed alive, and preserving the legacy of his father and grandfather without allowing it to be turned into something cheap or fake. Tim has often explained that being on television brought with it a whole set of new problems, challenges he'd never imagined when life was quieter. Strangers began showing up in Climax just to see him. Tourists drove through his small town hoping for a glimpse. Reporters came digging with questions about his family. And some people even tried sneaking onto his property just to snap a picture of a still. For a man who had spent his entire life trying to keep things quiet, this sudden exposure was nerve-wracking. He had to build fences, install cameras, and move through life more cautiously than ever, aware that thousands of eyes were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. What the audience rarely sees are the sacrifices behind the scenes. The countless nights when Tim came home too exhausted to talk, the family gatherings and events he missed because filming or business always came first, the times he looked at his loved ones and said, "Just one more season," even though he knew it meant giving up more time with them. He understood that walking away too soon might undo everything he had built. Fame pays, yes, but it also takes. And for Tim, the cost was deeply personal. One of the most heartbreaking things he has ever shared was the passing of his father. That loss wasn't simply about saying goodbye to a parent. It meant losing the man who had taught him everything, who had stood by him when the law closed in, and who believed without a doubt that their family tradition was something worth defending. Tim has admitted, when his father died, it felt as if the very air had been sucked out of the room, and it never fully returned. He kept working. He kept filming. But the emptiness lingered. That grief fueled him to push harder to succeed the right way. He wanted his father to be proud. He wanted the name Smith to carry meaning far beyond mug shots and arrest records. Alongside his grief, Tim also battled health issues. Some came from the stress of living two lives at once, some from the physical toll of decades as a firefighter, and others simply from getting older while never slowing down. At times, he had no choice but to pause and face the truth. He couldn't do everything on his own. For a man used to being the one in control, fixing problems and carrying the load, this was one of the hardest lessons of all. Another tragedy in Tim's story is the way the moonshine world itself has changed. When he was a boy, moonshining was sacred and secret. It was passed down quietly from father to son, hidden from outsiders. But after Moonshiners became a hit show, everything shifted. Suddenly, people everywhere wanted to call themselves moonshiners. Tourists wanted to take selfies beside stills. Hobbyists were building backyard setups just to brag that they'd done it. Tim has admitted that this makes him sad at times because for him, moonshining was never about fun or novelty. It was about survival, keeping the lights on, making it through long winters when money was scarce. Through all of this, Tim never left the fire department. That fact alone reveals a lot about the man he is. He could have easily stepped away once the fame and money started rolling in, but instead, he kept putting on the uniform, answering calls, and walking into situations where tragedy was waiting. He pulled people out of wrecks, stood by burning homes, and listened to the cries of families who had lost everything. Then, after those harrowing moments, he would go film a TV show where people expected him to laugh, joke, and entertain. Carrying that kind of weight, moving from heartbreak to humor in the same day is a burden that could break anyone. There were moments when it nearly broke Tim. He thought about disappearing completely, retreating into the woods and leaving everything behind. But quitting has never been in his nature. That refusal to give up is what makes his story both painful and inspiring. He kept going, even when it hurt, even when doubt surrounded him, and even when exhaustion threatened to bring him down. Some of the deepest scars came from losing friends. Over the years, members of the Moonshiners family faced death, addiction, and prison. Each loss cut deeply into Tim's heart. He once said that moonshining had both saved his life and nearly ruined it at the same time. That single sentence sums up the tragedy of his journey. Moonshining gave him purpose, identity, and a way to honor his family's legacy. But it also made him a target, brought danger, destroyed friendships, and nearly cost him his freedom more than once. Being a public figure added another layer of pain. People assumed they knew him, and many felt entitled to say whatever they wanted. Tim has had to endure harsh comments, cruel rumors, and gossip on top of everything else. He has been accused of selling out, of faking things for television, of turning a serious way of life into a joke. He often tries to brush it off, but words cut deep. He keeps working, keeps smiling, but behind his eyes there is pain that not everyone sees. His life has been full of danger, loss, and relentless pressure. And when the cameras are off, those struggles show in the quiet moments. Looking at Tim Smith today, you don't just see a man who grew up running through the woods of Climax with jars of clear liquor, hiding behind trees at the sound of a truck. You see someone who has lived what feels like 1,000 lives in one. He is now a husband, a father, a businessman, a firefighter, and a television personality, each role carrying the weight of generations before him. Over the years, as Moonshiners grew into a show with millions of viewers, Tim had to face what it meant to become the face of an entire culture. Fans turned to him not just for entertainment, but for guidance, reassurance, and proof that the old ways weren't gone. Tim has tried to live up to that expectation. He has spoken for little towns like Climax, for families still depending on moonshining to survive, for men and women who still know how to build a still from scraps and keep it hidden deep in the woods. But being the voice of such a heritage is exhausting. It's a pressure that follows him everywhere, and for someone raised in privacy, it has never been easy. Today, Tim walks a fine line between two worlds. On one hand, he has brought moonshine out of the shadows bottled, labeled, and sold legally on store shelves in places where it once would have been destroyed by federal agents. On the other hand, he still feels tied to the old days, the secret nighttime runs, the smell of mash cooking in the woods, the adrenaline of outsmarting the law. Even though he's legal now, he admits there's still a part of him that looks over his shoulder when headlights appear suddenly on a dark back road. Through all of this, one of the most powerful parts of Tim's journey has been his family. His wife has stood by him through every hardship. The lean years when Moonshining paid the bills. The early seasons of the show when cameras invaded their lives. And the stressful nights when he feared his business would collapse. She has seen him come home from fire calls with burdens too heavy to put into words. Watched him struggle under financial pressures. And carried with him the stress of critics and endless work. And yet, she has remained his anchor. Knowing that his son is watching forces him to think beyond himself about the example he's setting, the legacy he's leaving, and the future he's building. One of the biggest reasons he fought so hard to go legal was so his son wouldn't grow up in fear the way he did. Always watching the road, wondering if tonight would be the night the law took his father away. In that decision, you can see that Tim's story isn't just about survival. It's about breaking a cycle. There were times when his legal business nearly failed. He had to borrow, negotiate, and fight for every step forward. He was often up against powerful liquor companies who wanted him out. The politics of the industry were brutal, filled with red tape and rules designed to crush small distillers. He spent countless hours traveling, chasing deals, and facing disappointment when things fell apart. Add to that the constant cameras, the pressure to entertain, the critics waiting for him to fail. The weight became nearly unbearable. Tim has been open about how stress affects him. There were moments when he came close to burning out, when the endless work wore him down to the bone, when all he wanted was to sit in the woods, listen to the crickets, and remember peace. But he always got back up. His father had taught him never to stay down no matter how hard life hits. And Tim has lived by that lesson again and again. In the later seasons of Moonshiners, fans have seen more of Tim's softer side. The side that worries. The side that reflects on the journey. The side that mourns for friends lost along the way. He has lost fellow Moonshiners to accidents, illness, and addiction. And every loss hurts deeply. These weren't just co-stars. They were family, bound by shared risks in the same way of life. Losing them leaves a hole that never fully heals. Tim has admitted that those losses remind him constantly of the dangers Moonshiners have always. It's faced that every jar carries not only skill, but also risk. One of the most emotional things he has ever shared is how he feels connected to his father whenever he runs a still. In those moments, he can almost see him standing nearby, hear his voice reminding him, do it right or don't do it at all. That connection is powerful, but bittersweet. It keeps him grounded in his roots while reminding him of the pain of absence. That balance between pride and grief is what gives Tim's story so much weight. Because for him, Moonshining has never been just a business or a TV show. It has always been a link to the people he loved most and lost. Despite all the hardships, Tim has used his platform to give back. He has spoken at events, mentored young people about staying out of trouble, and shown that it's possible to turn something once illegal into something legitimate through determination. In the end, his story isn't just about moonshine. It's about redemption, resilience, and transformation. It's about taking scars and turning them into strength, carrying burdens, but not letting them define you. And that is what makes Tim Smith's journey not only tragic, but profoundly inspiring.